Came on. All right. So welcome everyone to Tranquil Thursday here at Mount Vernon. I'm Mark Kelly.
I'm Nicholas Kimball.
We're two of the blacksmiths here at Mount Vernon. So we'll kind of talk you through some of the history of the shop, what it was used for historically, what we do today, that type of thing. So to give kind of a frame of reference, we're about 200 feet away from the mansion right now, so I can actually see it through the window. So we're up by that area where all the outbuildings and the servants' hall and the kitchen and that type of thing are. So this was basically the headquarters in the sense of Washington's plantation in the 18th century. And the shop that currently sits here today is a reproduction. So opened to the public April 1st, 2009. In the 18th century, the shop functioned as a maintenance shop really for the plantation in the 18th century. So the first reference that we have is in 1755 that Washington writes that the chimney in the smith's shed is finished, and then it's finished up the carpentry work, Washington writes in 1768, and runs till about the time General Washington passes away. It's not 100% clear when the shop goes out of use, but by the mid-19th century, there's an ice house that's built kind of off the corner of where the blacksmith shop currently sits. And throughout that about 45 years that the shop operated, there were 3 enslaved men who were doing most of the blacksmithing work here at Mount Vernon. There were 4 smiths that are recorded as regularly doing work in the shop. So the first smith is a slave by the name of Peter. We're not sure how he gets to Mount Vernon, how he gets trained, but by all accounts, he's a very skilled smith in the shop. Washington spends a period of time in here making 2 plows with him at one point. He falls off the records in 1770, so it's believed that he unexpectedly passes away. And Washington hires either a Dutch or German, we're not sure, man by the name of Dominicus Gubner, who works on a day basis for 19 days in 1770, and then serves 3 consecutive one-year contracts from 70 to 73. In fall of 73, 2 smiths and 2 enslaved men, Nat and George, take over the running of the shop and run it till about the time General Washington passed away in 99. Most of their work would have been agricultural in nature, so fixing things like axes, hoes, plows, rakes, shovels, that type of thing. Do you want to talk about the forge, how it works?
Well, the forge that we have set up over here is, we believe, fairly typical of a Chesapeake region style. We've got our main portion of the forge over here with the coal fire. It's already going for us here. And the bellows is coming off the side. To operate the bellows, we've got this lever we pull down on. It inflates the bellows with the oxygen, which then forces it into our coal fire. Once this gets up to full temperature, it's going to be burning around about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. We're typically going to keep the metal itself between 2,000 and 2,500 degrees to then be able to shape it and form it into whatever desired item we have need for it. Right in front of me here we have the anvil. So that's where we do our hot work. We're going to take that hot metal out, place it down on the anvil, and start striking it with the hammer to draw that metal out, spread it out, and shape it into the desired tool or utensil. I'm going to go ahead and start working on a nail so you can see that in process. Now this tool right here is called a nail header. Once we start drawing at the tip of the nail, it's going to fit down into the hole in the top here. We'll cut off the excess stock, hammer on the top to spread out the head. We've got the shank drawn out there. See how well it fits. So still need to slim it out a little bit, cut it and head it. Here's my nail there.
So a lot of the work that we do in the shop today differs from what was done in the 18th century. Modern day, we're here as essentially a restoration shop for the museum. So making things like nails, other types of hardware, tools, cooking equipment, stuff like that to be used either in the restoration of the buildings or as demonstrations. For example, down on the Pioneer Farm, cooking demonstrations, farming. We make our own tools in the shop as well. In the 18th century, really the focus was keeping the wheat plantation in the later years of Washington's lifetime operation. So there were 8,000 acres just about by the end of Washington's lifetime. 3,200 of those acres were in growing crops, and the only blacksmith shop stood here where we're at right now on the entire estate. And those two enslaved men that I mentioned before, Nat and George, would have been the only two blacksmiths for that about 12.5 square mile plantation. So most of their focus was just in keeping that plantation operational. Generally, if Washington needed things that weren't agricultural in nature, most of them would have been purchased. So we do know that they had the tools to make nails, so 2 headers, the thing that Nicholas pointed to you folks just a little bit ago. We know that they had, from Washington's description of basically a confirmation receipt that he gets, that there was a large and small nail header. And then bundles of nail rod were also purchased. So they're probably making some here and there. But Washington's also putting in orders for, in some cases, tens of thousands of nails at a time, mostly coming from Europe. Washington's able to get those things at a relatively inexpensive cost. It's a much better use of the smith's time in the shop to keep the wheat plantation operational, because that's how Washington's making most of his money. So modern day, we get into lots of different things, but 18th century, most of the focus is agricultural in nature.
We do have a question. So Dave H. would like to know where you would have gotten the raw materials.
So there's 2 types of materials that would have been used in the 18th century: wrought iron and steel. Steel, Washington is going to be purchasing primarily from Europe. I think the first recorded reference is 50 pounds of steel were purchased in 1778. Steel was being made in the colonies, but not in enough volume to meet demand, so most of it was imported. That's going to be used for anything with an impact surface or a cutting edge. So say the face of a hammer or the bit, the blade section of an axe. That's going to be used much more sparingly as it's more expensive. So the whole axe wouldn't be made out of steel, for instance. Wrought iron is going to be what most of the head would be made out of. Same thing for most of the hammer and most other things that were used in the 18th century, like nails, different types of hardware. Washington in the early years is going to get wrought iron from about 9 miles south of where we are right now in Occoquan, Virginia. In the later years, it's going to come from sometimes the Shenandoah Valley, but Washington's going to get it from Philadelphia as well. He actually writes to his farm manager in 1794, if I have the year right, that he can get iron cheaper in Philadelphia than he can elsewhere. So he has him put together a list of different stock sizes that he needs to get sent to you.
We have another question here from Ellie. Was there an order in which they did their work each day?
We don't know, to be honest. I mean, getting the fire started is going to be the first step. Whether it was already going from the day before is a definite possibility. That's what we do today. But if it happens to go out overnight, or you want to clean the fire out, pull it apart the day before, and then build it back up again the next morning. But the records that Washington has for what work was done in the shop aren't as consistent throughout his entire lifetime. And we really don't know a lot about the daily lives of the blacksmiths who worked in the shop here. A lot of it is going to be seasonal as opposed to throughout an individual day. So whenever, say, the wheat is being harvested in late June and early July, when those tools are being used, they're more likely to break. So the repair of those different types of tools and perhaps repairs for wagons and things like that would be done more so around those harvesting times.
And we have another question. So what would a day at an 18th century blacksmith shop look like?
So again, it would kind of depend on the time of year and what work was being done. But mostly what the enslaved people in the 18th century would have gotten into was repairing plows, which were used very regularly to prepare the ground for planting or directly in relation to planting. So plowing right before the seeds actually go into the ground. Hoes were used frequently for weeding of fields, and then axes for splitting out firewood, fence rails, different things like that. So most often they're going to be getting into those three specific types of agricultural tools.
Might be nice to note also that their day is generally going to start at sunrise. And so it's going to make for a fairly long day. You're in the shop when the sun's coming up, getting ready to get things done for the day and going until sunset.
Yeah, so about 9 hours of daylight in the wintertime, about perhaps 14 or so in the summertime, but they had a break in the middle of the day for what would be like our lunch.
So another project I'm going to be working on here, if you come and visit us at Mount Vernon, you'll notice that we have these rope stanchions all over the place, holding up ropes, helping to keep people on the paths. And one of our tasks here now is to either repair or make new ones. So I've already got one preheating in the fire here. We've got the point put on it already, but I need to do the loop on the top. So we're just going to go ahead and work that through. Go ahead and put a little more heat back in there. Got our loop on the end. One of the older ones that came in for a repair recently. So need to clean that loop up a little bit, but see they're pretty close.
So mentioned before that really shop's going to be used mainly for repair of tools and agricultural equipment. In the 18th century, especially in Europe, there would have been specialized shops for making different specific items. So say, for example, Nicholas was making nails before. That's something that we make quite a bit in the shop today. But in the 18th century, a commercial nailery would have been making nails with nailers working in those shops. And they're generally not naileries that'd be making different size and types of nails, but in others there'd be hinge smithing shops, chain smithing shops, locksmithing shops, or even different types of locksmiths for making different specific parts. So in the 18th century, blacksmithing was a really specialized trade. Here at Mount Vernon, because it was a plantation, it's mainly focused on just fixing those items that were needed. But especially in Washington's earlier records, you see lots of different things being ordered from Europe, different items of hardware, tools, cooking equipment, different things like that. So modern day, we focus on a much wider range of things that's needed for the museum, but in the 18th century is much more narrow focus. And the smiths that worked in the shop, Nat and George and Peter, Nat was trained, we believe there's an indenture, it's like a contract, between a local Fairfax County blacksmith, Peter Galot. So Nat may have, if that contract got filled out, been with him for 3 years while George was here while Dominicus Bubner was running the shop. So they're really trained for the time frame in which Washington writes that they're competent in doing the work that he needs for the estate. So that repair work.
So we do have a question here from Cynthia. So could you possibly talk about the heat factor and how that affects the different types of metal that you're working with?
Like temperature-wise?
Mm-hmm.
So our general temperature that we work with is about 2,000 to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. They have heat ranges they prefer. So wrought iron tends to work at a higher temperature to help with the cohesion of it. The grain structure of its fiber is almost like wood grain, and that's caused through a silica slag. So at lower temperatures, that grain structure will start to split. So higher heat for wrought iron is better. Steel tends to work at a lower temperature. With the carbon content in it, we have lowered the melting temperature of it, and so we don't want to overheat it because then we will begin to either
Okay, we are back.
You're back. Okay, sorry about that. So not sure where I got cut off there, but wrought iron works at a higher temperature. Steel works at a lower temperature due to the carbon content, lowering the melting point. As those are the two primary materials we work with, I'm not really going to get into brass or copper or silver. All of them have different working temperatures, melting temperatures. So the iron and steel is going to be between typically 2,000 and 2,500 degrees.
Okay, then we have another question. So Rob would like to know what is used to put a finish on the rope holders, for example.
The finish we typically use in here is just going to be a beeswax applied while it's hot. So not a high heat, maybe just a couple hundred degrees. We'll brush off the scale or ash, get the loose debris off, and then apply beeswax and use a cloth to wipe off any excess. Occasionally, we'll use linseed oil as a finish, also applied when it's hot.
I think that is our last question for now.
Okay, last question. Well, would you like to talk about the plow? Okay. I know that's an exciting project we've been working on here.
So we mentioned before, plows were one of the items that would have been worked on in the 18th century. And plows were both made here at Mount Vernon and purchased. It seems like it's a piece of equipment that Washington's constantly looking for that's going to be better able to hold up and give better productivity. One of the plows that we've actually started to recreate here at Mount Vernon with the help of some smiths and the wheelwrights at Colonial Williamsburg is a Rotherham plow, which you can see sitting over on the table behind me here. Washington buys a Rotherham plow from the firm Crosby's and Crawford as purchases, but he talks about it very fondly even decades later. And he writes to Arthur Young in 1786 saying that he wasn't able to get replacement parts for the plow, but it was favorite that he's ever used. And the same thing whenever Benjamin Latrobe actually comes to visit 1796, Washington writes that it's one of his favorite that he's ever used. So we've been, the wheelwrights at Colonial Williamsburg made the wooden frame of the plow. And then Nicholas and I actually went down to learn some steps in making one of the pieces on the front, which is the share. It's what's going to do the kind of horizontal cut through the earth. So Ken Schwartz, the master blacksmith down there, was teaching us how to basically make that part. In the 18th century, this specific type of plow mostly would have been factory produced in Europe. And so Washington not being able to get replacement parts might be the reason why it went out of use. He writes that a bumbling country smith actually had ruined that plow that he had gotten in 1765. But there would have been different types of plows used across the estate throughout Washington's lifetime. There are about 30, if I remember right, in the inventory of the estate, the probate inventory after General Washington passes away. Sometimes they were shuffled between farms for use, depending on what was being planted and when, but it would have been one of the most abundant, larger pieces of equipment that you would have seen on the estate.
We have a question here, again from Cynthia. She's asking great questions today. So she was wondering, do you know what George Washington's thoughts about the moldboard plow was?
So the moldboard is actually part of the plow that's facing away from us right now. It's basically a curved piece of wood that turned the soil over. Not gonna lie, I'm not 100% on every different type of plow that was used in the 18th century. It seems like some types would have moldboard, some types would not. I'm not 100% sure what the difference is between which ones would and wouldn't, but the Rotherham plow did. It seems like it's something that Washington had on his plows throughout a good chunk of his lifetime. There's an order in 1788 where Washington buys 200 pounds of sheet iron, which was used to cover the mold boards of the plows to keep the soil from wearing them down. So just kind of a buffer. So it seems like that's something that's being done throughout his lifetime on at least some of the plows that were here to help protect them, to keep them lasting longer.
We have just more a general blacksmith question here. So Lily Sawyer wants to know, how long does it take to be a blacksmith? Do you go through an apprenticeship?
I'll go ahead and answer that. The general time frame to learn blacksmithing is really going to fluctuate from person to person. How much time and energy can they put into it? How long is it going to take to pick up those techniques, memorize the process? In the 18th century, we generally see a time frame of about 3 to 5 years for a basic training, understanding of your more common work. If you get involved in something more specialized, say like gun manufacturing, then you might see a significantly longer training period or apprenticeship, maybe 9+ years to complete that. Today, we still pass down blacksmithing through apprenticeship, but there's also schools, folk schools, colleges, guilds that are set up that help teach and pass on the knowledge. And so your apprenticeship isn't as necessary to get that hands-on training, get the information passed on. But we're still going to see typically about 3 to 5 years to get the basic knowledge and working understanding of how it's done. Tranquil. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up with a hook real quick. It's something that we do on the kitchen here as well. Hooks are pretty useful in the 18th century. So we hope you all enjoyed our little demonstration here and discussion. And hopefully we'll get to see you all soon. Have a good one.